The fashion world just sent Meghan Markle a message, and this time it wasn't subtle. It happened right at the front door. According to reports circulating among people connected to Manhattan's fashion scene, Meghan was turned away from a high-profile fashion show during New York Fashion Week this past weekend. Not delayed, not confused for someone else, not caught in a scheduling mix-up. Those familiar with the situation say security approached her directly and pulled her aside before she could enter. The message, reportedly delivered quietly but clearly, was simple. She was not welcome at the event. For what was supposed to be a routine night out, the moment quickly became something else entirely. Meghan had arrived with a friend, hoping to enjoy the energy of Fashion Week, the cameras, the buzz, the sense of cultural relevance that events like this still carry. Some observers believe appearances like these can help shape public perception, offering carefully controlled visibility at just the right moments. But instead of stepping into the spotlight, she was stopped before she ever reached it. And according to people who claim knowledge of the situation, the decision didn't come from a random security guard making a judgment call. It reportedly followed internal discussions involving event organizers, brand representatives, and public relations teams, groups whose primary job is managing risk, image, and headlines. From their perspective, the concern was simple. Attention can be valuable, but unpredictable attention can be costly. In an industry built almost entirely on perception, stability matters, control matters, predictability matters even more. And some insiders suggest that organizers worried her presence might shift focus away from fashion and toward controversy. Whether fair or not, that calculation appears to have shaped the outcome. Witnesses described the moment as tense, unexpected, awkwardly quiet, and by several accounts, deeply emotional. Some people present claim Meghan appeared stunned at first, as if trying to process what was happening. Others say the moment quickly escalated into visible distress. Different descriptions circulate depending on who is telling the story. Some say she expressed frustration. Others say she felt singled out or unfairly targeted. As with many high-profile public moments, the exact details vary depending on the source. But nearly everyone agrees on one point. The rejection was unmistakable. And in an industry where visibility is currency, being turned away at the door sends a message that travels far beyond the building itself. Because in fashion, perhaps more than anywhere else, access is symbolic. Who is invited? Who is photographed? Who sits front row? Who is welcome backstage? Who is quietly excluded? These signals communicate status without anyone needing to say a word. And lately, many observers believe those signals have been changing. People who follow the industry closely say this moment didn't appear in isolation. Instead, they describe it as part of a broader shift, a gradual cooling that has been unfolding for some time. Invitations becoming less frequent, appearances drawing less enthusiasm, partnerships becoming more cautious. At first, these changes were subtle enough to dismiss. Now, some say they are becoming harder to ignore. Fashion, after all, has always been known for its short memory and even shorter loyalty. It embraces reinvention, but also distances itself quickly from anything seen as unpredictable. Brands spend years building carefully polished identities. They avoid uncertainty wherever possible. And right now, some insiders claim Meghan is viewed as exactly that, uncertain, not necessarily because of any single event, but because of the volume of attention that seems to follow her wherever she goes. Attention that isn't always controllable. Attention that doesn't always stay focused on fashion or philanthropy or media projects, but often shifts toward debate, controversy, or speculation. For brands that invest millions in image management, that kind of unpredictability can feel risky. Whether that perception is accurate, exaggerated, or completely misunderstood depends on who you ask. But perception alone can shape decisions, and in industries driven by optics, perception often becomes reality. The reported Fashion Week incident, then, may have been less about one evening and more about what that evening represented. A visible moment, a public boundary, a signal, intentional or not, that something has changed. And the timing makes the situation feel even more significant, because this moment comes after a particularly turbulent stretch of headlines and speculation surrounding Meghan's public standing. Media discussions have intensified in recent weeks, with commentators debating everything from brand strategy to professional relationships to long-term reputation management. Some analysts describe the current period as a crossroads, a moment when public figures either successfully reshape their narrative or struggle to regain control of it. And control of the narrative has always been central to Meghan's public identity. For years, she demonstrated a remarkable ability to shape conversation through interviews, carefully timed appearances, and personal storytelling that captured global attention. She understood how visibility works, how influence works, how to command the spotlight when it mattered most, which is precisely why this moment, being denied entry, being publicly stopped, being told not tonight, carries symbolic weight far beyond a single event. Because when someone known for controlling the narrative is suddenly placed outside of it, people notice. And in a week already filled with intense media discussion, industry speculation, and renewed public scrutiny, this incident has only added to the growing sense that something larger may be unfolding. Whether temporary or permanent, strategic or circumstantial, misunderstood or inevitable, the question many observers are now asking is simple. Is this an isolated moment of tension or a visible sign of a much deeper shift? And to understand why that question is gaining so much traction, you have to look at everything that has been happening around her at the same time. The Fashion Week moment didn't happen in a vacuum. It arrived during a period when pressure around Meghan's public image had already been building. Slowly at first, then all at once. In recent months, a steady stream of reports, rumors, and industry whispers has created an atmosphere of uncertainty around her brand. Some stories are confirmed, others remain speculation, but together, they have formed a pattern that many observers say is becoming difficult to ignore. One of the biggest sources of discussion has centered on finances connected to Archewell, the charitable and media organization founded by Meghan and Harry. Conversations about possible financial scrutiny have circulated widely in media commentary and online spaces. While details remain unclear and nothing official has been publicly confirmed, the mere existence of these discussions has drawn attention, and in reputation-driven industries, attention alone can shape perception. At the same time, separate claims from former staff members have resurfaced, adding another layer of complexity. Individuals who previously worked within Meghan's professional orbit have reportedly begun speaking. Some describe tense working environments. Others talk about pressure, expectations, or interpersonal conflict behind the scenes. As with many workplace-related claims involving high-profile figures, the accounts vary. Some are strongly worded. Others are more cautious. But collectively, they have fueled ongoing media debate about leadership style, professional relationships, and consistency between public messaging and private behavior. For someone whose public image has long emphasized compassion, advocacy, and emotional awareness, these narratives, whether fully accurate, partially accurate, or contested, create friction. And friction, when repeated often enough, can slowly reshape how audiences interpret everything else. Beyond internal and organizational matters, there are also signs that certain international opportunities may not be progressing as once expected. Over the past few years, Meghan and her team explored potential partnerships in several global markets, particularly regions where philanthropic initiatives, media ventures, and lifestyle branding often intersect with large-scale investment. Among the areas frequently mentioned in industry discussions were the Gulf states, where luxury branding, influence, and large-scale development frequently converge. But according to people familiar with those conversations, some of these potential pathways have cooled. Negotiations that once seemed promising reportedly stalled or quietly faded. Interest that once appeared strong became less certain. In some cases, communication simply stopped moving forward. Again, no single explanation has been publicly confirmed. Business decisions are rarely explained in full detail. But when multiple opportunities slow down at the same time, observers tend to interpret the pattern as meaningful, even when official statements remain limited. For public figures whose influence depends partly on global partnerships, expanding reach, and carefully built alliances, that kind of shift can have real consequences. Because influence is not only about visibility, it's also about access. And access depends on trust. When organizations consider collaborations, they weigh benefits against risk. They ask whether association strengthens their image or complicates it. They evaluate predictability, stability, and long-term alignment. If uncertainty enters that equation, hesitation often follows. And hesitation, once it begins, can spread quietly from one decision-maker to another. Meanwhile, media coverage itself has evolved. In earlier years, headlines often framed Meghan as a figure transformation, someone redefining identity, independence, and public life outside traditional institutions. The tone was frequently sympathetic, sometimes celebratory, often intensely curious. Now, analysts say the tone has shifted toward scrutiny. Coverage hasn't disappeared. Far from it. But the framing feels different. More questioning, more analytical, less assumption of positive intent, more focus on contradictions, inconsistencies, and long-term outcomes. This doesn't mean public interest has faded completely, but it does suggest that the nature of that interest has changed. And that change matters, because public reputation rarely collapses in a single dramatic moment. More often, it erodes gradually, shaped by accumulation rather than explosion. Each new headline influences interpretation of the next. Each unresolved question lingers beneath future coverage. Over time, perception becomes layered, complex, difficult to reset. Some media strategists describe this stage as narrative saturation, the point where audiences feel they have seen enough information to form fixed opinions. At that stage, changing perception becomes significantly harder, even with new projects, interviews, or public appearances. And this is where the Fashion Week rejection takes on deeper meaning. On its own, being turned away from an event could be dismissed as a misunderstanding, a scheduling issue, or a private organizational decision. But when it happens against the backdrop of ongoing scrutiny, industry hesitation, and shifting media tone, it begins to look less like an isolated inconvenience and more like a visible expression of something already in motion, a symptom rather than a cause. Observers who track reputation cycles say these visible moments often function as signals, not because they create change, but because they reveal change that has already been developing beneath the surface. In other words, the door didn't close suddenly. It may have been slowly closing for quite some time. And to understand how dramatic that shift feels to many watchers, it helps to remember just how different things once looked. Because not long ago, Meghan Markle stood at the center of one of the most powerful waves of global public sympathy in modern celebrity history. There was a time when her voice commanded full international attention, when major interviews reshaped global conversations, when institutions responded, when public support surged across continents. To understand the contrast between that moment and the one unfolding now, you have to go back to where the modern chapter of her public story truly transformed, to the moment when the world stopped and listened. To understand why recent events feel so striking to many observers, you have to go back to the moment when Meghan Markle's global influence appeared stronger than ever. It was 2020. A single televised conversation reshaped the public narrative overnight. When Meghan and Prince Harry sat down with Oprah Winfrey, the interview quickly became one of the most talked-about media events in the world. Millions watched live. Millions more watched clips, commentary, and analysis in the days that followed. The reaction was immediate and powerful. Across large parts of the global audience, sympathy surged. The couple's account of their experiences inside the royal institution sparked intense emotional response. Discussions about mental health, media pressure, and institutional rigidity dominated headlines. Support poured in from celebrities, public figures, and viewers who felt they were witnessing something deeply personal and deeply revealing. For many, Meghan was seen as someone who had stepped away from power not out of ambition, but out of necessity. Someone choosing personal well-being over tradition. Someone speaking openly about struggles that had long remained hidden behind palace walls. It was a defining moment. Public perception shifted dramatically. Conversations about the British monarchy intensified. Media narratives across multiple countries framed the interview as a turning point, not just for the royal family, but for how modern public figures could redefine their roles outside long-standing institutions. And for Meghan personally, it marked the beginning of what many believed would be a new era. After stepping back from royal duties, she and Harry entered a phase of reinvention. Canada offered them space and distance during their transition. Major media companies expressed strong interest in working with them. Streaming platforms announced partnerships. Podcast deals were signed. Documentary projects were developed. Opportunities seemed everywhere. The couple positioned themselves as independent voices, no longer bound by royal expectations, but still carrying global recognition. The idea was compelling. A modern power pair reshaping influence on their own terms, combining celebrity visibility with activism, storytelling, and philanthropy. At the time, many analysts described their potential as enormous. Meghan, in particular, appeared positioned to build a unique personal brand, one rooted in advocacy, media production, and carefully curated public appearances. She wrote essays. She participated in high-profile interviews. She remained a frequent subject of international discussion. For a period, it seemed as though every move carried weight. Every appearance generated headlines. Every statement fueled conversation. Visibility was constant. Influence appeared secure. But powerful public narratives are fragile, and sustaining them requires consistency, not just in message, but in perception. Over time, subtle shifts began to appear. At first, they were small enough to overlook. Differences in how various groups interpreted the couple's actions. Questions raised in opinion columns. Debates emerging online about tone, presentation, or authenticity. Nothing dramatic, nothing definitive. Just small changes in the atmosphere surrounding the story. Then the focus began to move behind the scenes. Reports started surfacing from individuals who had worked within royal environments or related professional circles. Some accounts described difficult workplace dynamics. Others suggested tension between public messaging and private interactions. These claims, like many involving high-profile figures, were complex and disputed. Not everyone agreed. Not every story aligned. But the existence of multiple voices describing challenging experiences introduced a new element into the broader public conversation. Consistency, the foundation of strong personal branding, began to feel less certain. For someone whose public identity centered heavily on empathy, emotional awareness, and advocacy for well-being, even the suggestion of internal conflict created a sharp contrast. Observers began comparing public image with reported private behavior. And once that comparison starts, it tends to repeat. Then came one of the couple's most anticipated projects, the streaming documentary series intended to share their story in their own words. Expectations were high. Many viewers assumed it would reinforce their earlier narrative, offering deeper context and emotional insight. Supporters expected clarity. Critics expected controversy. What followed was something more complicated. The series generated enormous attention, but reactions were mixed. Some viewers remained deeply sympathetic. Others felt the presentation seemed overly polished, overly rehearsed, or carefully staged. Certain scenes became widely discussed online, with audiences debating tone, authenticity, and interpretation. Even small details became subjects of analysis. Moments intended to humanize the couple were sometimes reinterpreted as performative. Emotional storytelling, once accepted without question, began facing closer scrutiny. Viewers compared statements made in different interviews, noticing differences in wording or timing. For the first time, widespread discussion shifted from what was being said to whether it fully aligned with previous accounts. This shift was subtle but important, because once audiences begin fact-checking narrative details, the nature of engagement changes. Trust becomes conditional. Support becomes more cautious. Interpretation becomes more analytical. And in the age of digital media, where archived interviews, public records, and past statements are easily accessible, consistency is constantly evaluated. Over time, more observers began pointing out discrepancies, small differences in timelines, variations in phrasing, details that appeared inconsistent depending on the platform or context. Some critics framed these as misunderstandings. Others interpreted them as contradictions. Regardless of interpretation, the effect was the same. Public confidence became less unified. Meanwhile, online conversation evolved rapidly. Social media users, once largely protective, began debating more openly. Commentary channels expanded coverage. Analysts revisited earlier claims with fresh perspective. Support did not disappear, but it became more divided, and division changes the energy surrounding public figures. Instead of one dominant narrative, multiple competing narratives begin circulating at once. Each audience segment interprets new events through its own lens. which means every appearance, every project, every public moment carries heightened risk because now nothing is received neutrally. And as this environment grew more complex, something else began happening quietly within industries that rely heavily on public perception, fashion, entertainment, branding, and media partnerships. Enthusiasm began to cool, not abruptly, not dramatically, but gradually. Invitations became less frequent. Collaborations required more caution. Public associations became more carefully considered. At first, these adjustments were almost invisible from the outside, but inside those industries, people were noticing the shift, and eventually, the shift became visible enough that it could no longer be explained away as coincidence. Because when reputation begins changing behind the scenes, it often shows itself first in access. Who gets invited, who gets welcomed, who gets quietly kept at a distance. And now, with the Fashion Week incident fresh in public memory, many observers believe they may be witnessing the visible result of years of slow, incremental change. A transformation not marked by one dramatic collapse, but by a long sequence of subtle turning points. And while professional opportunities appear to be tightening, some reports suggest the pressure may not be limited to public image alone, because according to sources close to the situation, the strain may also be affecting something far more personal, the relationship at the center of everything. As public perception grows more complicated, attention has also begun shifting toward the personal dynamic at the center of Meghan's world, her marriage to Prince Harry. For years, their partnership was presented as unified, determined, and unshakable. They spoke often about standing together against pressure, choosing independence, and building a new life on their own terms. Their shared narrative emphasized resilience, two people facing global scrutiny side by side. But recently, some observers and commentators say the tone surrounding Harry himself appears to be changing. People described as familiar with the couple's social and professional circles suggest he has become noticeably more withdrawn. Reports describe him spending more time out of the spotlight, limiting public appearances, and avoiding situations that draw intense media attention. Long walks, private time, less visible engagement. None of these behaviors are unusual for someone living under constant global scrutiny. But when patterns shift, especially for someone who once spoke so openly and passionately in defense of his partner, observers tend to notice. In earlier years, Harry's public role was clear. He was outspoken, direct, and unwavering. He challenged institutions, confronted criticism, and positioned himself as both protector and advocate. Now, some reports suggest a quieter presence, more reflective, more cautious, less publicly assertive. Those who claim insight into his mindset describe someone navigating pressures that may be far more intense than anticipated. Life outside the structure of the royal institution, once framed as liberation, also removed the systems that had long defined his identity, routine, and sense of purpose. Inside the monarchy, roles are clearly structured, expectations are defined, public function is built into daily life. Outside of it, identity must be constructed differently, especially when global visibility remains constant. Several commentators who study high-profile transitions have pointed out that moving from institutional identity to fully independent celebrity can be psychologically complex. Structure disappears. Public expectations multiply. Every decision becomes personal rather than procedural. And for Harry, that adjustment may be ongoing. Some reports claim he has expressed nostalgia for aspects of his former life, not necessarily the restrictions, but the clarity, the sense of defined purpose, the framework that gave meaning to daily responsibilities, the connection to long-standing tradition and national service. These reflections, if accurate, suggest an internal tension between the freedom he chose and the stability he left behind. There have also been quiet discussions, largely unconfirmed but widely circulated, that he may have explored reconnecting in limited ways with individuals linked to his past royal environment. Not publicly, not formally, but cautiously, privately, and carefully. No official moves, no announcements, just tentative communication, according to some accounts. If true, even at a small scale, such outreach would carry symbolic weight, because it would suggest that the separation once presented as complete may feel more complicated in practice. Meanwhile, Within the public sphere, the couple's joint projects have faced increasing difficulty generating the kind of enthusiasm that once seemed automatic. Media coverage continues, but often with a different tone. More analytical, more questioning, more focus on outcomes rather than intention. Journalists who once eagerly pursued interviews are now described by some insiders as more selective, not unwilling to engage, but less willing to present narratives without challenge or scrutiny. In practical terms, this creates a difficult situation. It's not that Meghan and Harry lack attention. It's that they cannot fully control the nature of that attention. And control, especially narrative control, has always been central to how they have communicated with the public. Friends and commentators observing from a distance describe a dynamic that appears increasingly complex. Public pressure, professional uncertainty, and intense media observation can place strain on any relationship. When every decision is analyzed globally, even ordinary disagreements or stress responses can feel magnified. Some accounts describe tension, others describe fatigue. Still others suggest simple exhaustion from years of relentless scrutiny. None of these experiences would be unusual given the circumstances, but together, they contribute to a growing perception that the environment surrounding the couple has become heavier, more complicated, and more difficult to navigate than in the early days of their independence. And that perception matters, because public figures are shaped not only by reality, but by how reality is interpreted. At the same time, Meghan's own public identity appears to be facing mounting pressure from multiple directions. Her brand, once built around influence, advocacy, and cultural relevance, now exists in a far more crowded and skeptical media landscape. The mechanisms that once amplified her voice so powerfully, major interviews, coordinated media partnerships, widespread public sympathy, no longer operate with the same intensity. Reputation, once polished and tightly managed, now exists under layers of competing narratives, conflicting interpretations, and continuous debate. Professional opportunities appear more selective, public response more divided, industry enthusiasm more cautious. And with each passing headline, the central question grows louder. Can the narrative be rebuilt, or has the environment permanently changed? Because reputation, once destabilized, rarely returns to its previous form. It evolves into something new, sometimes stronger, sometimes weaker, sometimes simply different. And right now, many observers believe Meghan stands at a point of transition, a moment where the direction forward is uncertain. Her public image is under pressure. Her professional access appears more limited. Her personal environment, according to some reports, is increasingly strained. And then came the moment in New York, a moment that seemed to capture all those pressures in a single visible scene. A woman who once commanded global attention, standing outside an event she expected to enter, facing a closed door. But the most important question isn't what happened that night. The real question is what happens next. Because history shows that public figures rarely disappear quietly. They adapt, they pivot, they attempt reinvention. The challenge is whether the systems that once supported reinvention are still willing to participate. And right now, that remains unclear. There was a time when Meghan Markle could walk into almost any room and instantly become the center of attention. Cameras would turn. Headlines would follow. Conversations would shift around her presence. She understood visibility, how to generate it, how to guide it, how to use it. For years, her ability to shape narrative was one of her greatest strengths. Every appearance, every interview, every carefully timed statement played a role in building a powerful public identity. But today, many observers believe something fundamental has changed. Because influence isn't just about being seen. It's about being welcomed. And the signals coming from multiple industries, fashion, media, global partnerships, suggest that welcome may no longer be automatic. The New York Fashion Week incident felt symbolic precisely because of what it represented. Not simply a denied entry, but a visible shift in access. A moment when the contrast between past influence and present uncertainty became impossible to ignore. Once, she was invited everywhere. Now, some doors appear hesitant to open, and hesitation in reputation-driven environments spreads quickly. Brands pay close attention to perception. Media organizations monitor audience sentiment. Event organizers evaluate potential controversy before extending invitations. When uncertainty enters the equation, risk calculations change. That process rarely happens publicly. It happens quietly, one decision at a time. A partnership not pursued, an invitation not sent, a meeting not scheduled, an opportunity that simply fades. Individually, these moments seem minor. Collectively, they reshape access. For Meghan, whose public influence has long depended on visibility and strategic presence, reduced access carries profound implications because rebuilding narrative requires platforms. It requires audiences willing to listen. It requires institutional support that amplifies message and meaning. If those mechanisms weaken, reinvention becomes significantly harder. And reinvention has always been the likely next step. Observers widely expect that she will attempt to pivot again, perhaps through new media projects, philanthropic initiatives, public speaking, or carefully designed appearances meant to reset perception. Reinvention is not unusual for public figures, especially those navigating intense scrutiny. But successful reinvention depends on timing, credibility, and public willingness to engage. And that last factor may be the most uncertain of all, because something subtle but powerful appears to be happening within public discourse. The emotional intensity that once surrounded Meghan's story seems to be fading. Not entirely, not everywhere, but enough that commentators have begun noticing the change. The debates feel quieter, the reactions less urgent, the collective attention less focused. For years, discussion about her dominated news cycles, social media, and cultural conversation. Supporters defended passionately. Critics responded just as strongly. Every development triggered waves of analysis. Now, some analysts suggest a different phenomenon, maybe emerging attention fatigue. Audiences who once followed every development closely may be engaging less frequently. Media coverage continues, but often with reduced emotional charge. Stories appear, circulate briefly, and move on. And for someone whose power has long depended on commanding narrative space, fading intensity may represent the most difficult challenge of all, because criticism can be answered, controversy can be addressed, opposition can be confronted, but indifference is harder to overcome. When audiences stop reacting, positively or negatively, influence begins to lose its foundation. This is why some commentators describe the current phase not as a reputational crisis, but as a relevance crossroads. The question is no longer simply how people feel about Meghan. The question is whether they feel strongly enough to keep paying attention. And that brings the story back to the image that has come to symbolize this moment. A high-profile public figure arriving at an event where presence once felt guaranteed, being told, politely but firmly, that entry is no longer available. Not tonight, not this time. A small moment, but one that reflects a much larger shift. Because for someone who mastered the art of shaping public narrative, the greatest challenge may no longer be criticism, controversy, or even rejection. The greatest challenge may be silence. Silence from institutions that once amplified her voice. Silence from industries that once competed for her presence. Silence from audiences who once reacted instantly. Silence that suggests attention itself may be moving elsewhere. And if that is true, then the real turning point isn't the headlines that appear. It's the absence of the headlines that once would have. For years, Meghan Markle influenced global conversation by controlling how her story was told. Now, the central question is whether the world is still listening closely enough for that story to be reshaped at all. Because in public life, reputation can survive criticism. It can survive controversy. It can even survive rejection. But surviving irrelevance is far more difficult.